Hi everyone, good morning. My name is Morgan, and welcome to the MD Consultants live Facebook Q&A. So today I'll be answering some questions about medical school interviews. So to introduce myself and to give you a bit about my background, I'm a University of Calgary or Cumming School of Medicine medical student, and I'm in first year medical school. So prior to medical school, I did my undergrad at the University of Calgary in Health and Society, and I did 3 years of undergrad before interviewing and then subsequently getting accepted. And yeah, so I guess outside of school, throughout undergrad, I was on the rowing team and I enjoyed a lot of baking as well as volunteering and extracurriculars. So I have a list of questions here about medical school interviews, and I'll be going through and answering those. But if anybody tunes in and has a question, I'm happy to answer them as we go. So feel free just to type something in the comment section, and I'll answer it while I'm on here. Yeah, so I'll start off with the first question. And that is, what advice can you give about preparing for medical school interviews, and top advice? So I think a big thing for me is practice, practice, practice. I know like a lot of individuals say that interviews come naturally and they don't require practice at all. And while that might have worked for some people, I definitely went the route of practice. So for me, I set up a schedule once I got my interview dates, and I tried to practice at least once a day. And I know that kind of sounds a bit excessive maybe to some people, but for me, consistency was a big thing. And whether it was practicing for 20 minutes or for an hour, I really like to get into a routine just to try out a few questions every single day and get practice answering them, so that I knew how to talk about each of my extracurriculars, and how to tell those stories in a fluid and clear way. And so I did that a lot through practicing. And for me, the practicing didn't have to be with somebody within the medical field. I think that might be a misconception. So a lot of times I just practiced with family friends or even just friends within my program or within different programs. And I just had them comment on the way that I was speaking and if what I was saying was clear and if I actually answered the question. Because I think sometimes it's quite easy to get flustered when we're given a question, especially if it's something that we're not anticipating. And so answering it and making sure that you actually answer the question that was asked of you rather than rambling on is something that I definitely had to practice and make sure that I was actually doing. So I think my first big tip would definitely be practice, practice, practice. And of course, MD consultants can definitely help out with that, as well as especially with providing some targeted and very educated advice on your answers. And then I think another big tip that I would have too is to answer questions that you might not necessarily think will be in your interviews. And I know it's a lot of times you get these giant lists of practice questions online, and I found myself at the beginning going through and saying, oh, I don't think that they'll answer this, they'll ask this question, and so I would skip over it. But I think you would never really know what will come up on your interview, and you should actually probably pick the questions that scare you the most, because I would always say, oh, I don't think that they'll ask this question when it was a question that I didn't really know what I would say or didn't really have an answer. So I think that definitely practice those. And I think when you're practicing with friends and you send them the giant list of questions and they can pick any question, that kind of helps with that spontaneity and getting questions that you wouldn't really anticipate. And then also too, my final tip is to look at your school and to look at the resources that they have there. I think that it's not really well known, but a lot of schools do help with some interview practice and interview tips. So I know like at our career center, you can't go like every single day, obviously, but I think you could go like once or twice a month and they'll set up a mock interview for you. And like they did everything for me from having me exit the room and knock on the door and enter and all of that. So, and it was completely free. So that would be a good resource to look into, just because it's something extra and something added to the practice, in addition to practicing with a consultant or with friends. It just adds another dynamic and kind of, especially when they make you exit the room and it's with somebody that you've never met before, it can kind of replicate that a little bit of the anxiety that you might get when you're going into an interview, just to normalize it. So I guess to summarize then, my 3 big tips would be 1, practice. 2, don't be afraid of questions that you think that might not be on the interview, because you don't want to get slipped up if they actually are. So definitely face those fears. And then 3, look at the resources that your school has to help facilitate that practice. All right, for the second question, it was, what was your biggest fear about interviewing for medical school and how did you overcome that? So I think for me, it was probably just being totally thrown off by a question and not having an answer, and then just rambling and it being awkward. I think that was probably a big fear for me. And I think the way that I got over that is just honestly just practicing and practicing and not knowing. So for me, how I practiced was I would kind of line up all my friends on different days and then have them ask me different questions, but I wouldn't tell them what kinds of questions I wanted or which questions that I wanted them to ask. So it was a total surprise. And I think that really helped me emulate some of the awkwardness that could arise. So especially at the beginning of my practice, there was numerous times where I just had to stop and be like, can I restart with my friends and practice again? And I think just being in those situations where it was a bit awkward and my answers weren't perfect helped me to kind of understand how to come out of that and how to turn my answer around to finish it strong. And then with practice also, I learned to kind of understand when I was starting to ramble, when I was starting to not have a cohesive answer, and recognize that early on so that I could turn my answer around. And then another big thing I learned to help kind of avoid that awkwardness that I was scared of getting into was just to not try to rush my answers. So especially at the beginning of my practice, I really wanted to just jump right into the question and kind of spew an answer out before I really thought about it. But while sometimes that often led to an answer that wasn't clear. And so later on in my practice, I really started to pause at the beginning. And while that seemed a little bit awkward to me at first, having that moment to think really helped me have a clear answer and a stronger answer that left a better impression. So definitely my biggest fear was not having an answer to one of their questions or rambling on and not actually answering the question and becoming awkward. And then the way that I kind of resolved that was putting myself in those awkward situations with my friends and practicing how to kind of steer around that and being comfortable with my answers and being in those types of situations. So really just facing that fear and becoming comfortable with it. All right, so the next question is, when did you start preparing for interviews? Did you wait until you received interview invitations? So for me, I definitely did wait until I received interview invitations. I think that you could definitely start practicing earlier. However, I was in 3rd year when I applied, so I wasn't really sure how many interviews I would be getting. And then also I really wanted to ensure that my GPA was strong in 3rd year and that I was focusing on school so that if I did have to apply in 4th year, I would have an even stronger application. And then also, was aware that University of Calgary would give you about a month in advance to prep for your interviews, and then the rest of my interviews would have been in Ontario. So I knew I interviewed at Toronto as well, and I knew that coming from out of province that they would give you an extra week or so. So I knew that I would definitely have time to practice in advance after getting my interview invitation. So for me, that decision was a balance between ensuring that I had enough time to spend on my academics and extracurriculars to ensure that I was a strong applicant if I did have to apply next year, and then also being aware that my interview invitations would probably come with 3 to a month 3 weeks to about a month in advance of me knowing when I would be interviewing. So that would give me probably sufficient time to prepare for them. So that's kind of where my decision came in, to wait till I got interview invitations to start preparing. But I think that if you, I know Toronto, they can let you know super last minute, especially if you're applying from in province. So you might want to start preparing in advance if that's the case. I think it really depends on kind of what schools you're applying to and when they might typically announce the interview date, so that you have a good 3 weeks at least, I would say, to prepare. Probably a month ideally, and that's Calgary is nice, and they do give you that. So that's kind of when I started preparing. And it did go quite intense during my preparations. My theory was the interview is a big component, and I want to make a good impression, and I hadn't really done too many interviews of this nature before. And I'm always the person that likes to prepare in advance. So that's why I kind of, once I got the interview notifications, and I had about a month to 3 weeks, depending on which one, I practice honestly every day. So yeah. So how can you avoid interview fatigue? All right, so I think that's like one of the big surprises for me, is how tired I actually was during the interview, especially at Calgary. So the interview process at Calgary is super, super long. I think we had about, I think it was around 8 to 9 MMIs, each at about like 7 to 8 minutes. And then you also had 2 24-minute panels. And then you had a group interview that was probably another 20 minutes or so. And so it was quite long, especially compared to Toronto per se, which is just for, I think it was like 12-minute MPIs, which is they're like a mix between an MMI and a panel. It's their like specific style of interview. So Calgary was definitely long, and it was super, super tiring. And that's not something that I really anticipated. And I was kind of surprised by, because I was like, oh, like, I go to class every day, and I'm out and about for more than 8 hours. So I'll be fine interviewing. But I think it was just so overwhelming, everything going on at once, and having to introduce yourself and put yourself in a vulnerable situation, that it was just like socially exhausting, at least for me. So how do you avoid the interview fatigue? I think it's probably something that's tough to avoid, but I think it's something that you can be aware of and be ready for. So I think firstly, getting a good night's sleep the night before would be really, really big. And then I think also kind of waking up at the same time for the week beforehand. I know I did that for my MCAT as well, just to kind of get ready. Waking up early in the morning and being ready at that time that I needed to go to the interview, just so kind of got into that routine and it wasn't a surprise that day. And then I think another one would probably be just to practice actually like full length interviews. I know probably finding somebody who wants to sit down with you for 4 hours or however long your interview process is, depending on the school, is daunting, but I'm sure your friends will be happy to support you in that, especially if they're also applying to medical school or any other interview like type program, because then you can help them as well, and it can be a reciprocal process. And so I think like actually practicing the full length and especially the MMIs where you're timed and you have like the time to break and you're just moving and answering questions and moving and answering questions would be really, really useful. And then I also think too, if you do have a friend that's also applying to medical school and you're practicing with each other, I learned so much from other people's answers. Just the way that some of my friends structured their questions or the way that they approach different problems and adding in a different perspective. It was really, really good to be able to hear their answers. And I probably learned just as much as I did hearing their answers as I would have practicing just on my own. So I think definitely find a friend who's applying to med or has an interview and wants to practice, and then you guys can kind of share your perspective, especially on those ethical questions. I think that's a really, really good idea. So, but in terms of interview fatigue, definitely good night's sleep beforehand. Oh, lots of snacks. I thought that we'd be given more snacks during the interview day, but I think we only got like one cookie and like some juice, some snacks. And I think too, if you're flying in, maybe flying the day before. I know one person I know took a red eye the day of and landed the day of their interview, did their interview and flew out. And I think that was maybe a bit ambitious. I mean, it could have worked for them, but it probably wouldn't have worked for me. And then, so waking up at the same time, getting a good night's sleep, and then just practicing that stamina and endurance. So a full length interview, I think, would be ideal for avoiding that fatigue or at least being prepared for it. All right, so question 5 is, what style of interview do you find the easiest, hardest to prepare for? So the 3 types of interviews are MMI, panel, or MPI. And I actually did all 3. So, which would be the hardest to prepare for? I think maybe the MPI was the hardest for me to prepare for, not because it was a hard interview type, but I think it was just a little bit elusive to what it actually was for me, because it's different than, it's like a mix of an MMI and a panel, so I wasn't sure if it was like ethical questions or if it was like interpret quotes or if it was just going to be a question. So I was a little bit confused on what it was going to be, so I think that kind of made it harder to prepare for. But I know that if you are applying to the University of Toronto and interviewing there, that's the one who does use the MPI. They do have a good research article about the MPI, and it kind of explains the whole process. So I kind of found that towards the end, and I found that quite useful. And then just like going through and practicing, honestly, any questions that come up, and even if it's like a question that you're like, oh, I don't even think that they would ask that, definitely just practice it anyways, because then you're prepared for it and you're prepared for that awkwardness if it does arise. And then I also did find like the MMIs a little bit hard to prepare for, just because I think that there's so many right answers to different questions and so many different ways to approach it. And then there's also obviously some answers that aren't as good or not as ethical to approaching the MMI, but I think that there isn't just one specific answer. So I think especially if you're trying to practice the MMIs on your own, you can kind of get sucked into just understanding your perspective and thinking that the way you answered it is the right way. So I think a big tip for practicing the MMIs is to practice it with other people and be open to kind of seeing the situation from a new perspective, and not necessarily that your answer was wrong or that your friend's answer was wrong, but that there's multiple different ways to approach the ethical questions and multiple different ways to get to an answer that is ethical, and kind of understanding that and realizing those different perspectives, because that can actually help to strengthen your answer and to make it more rounded and make it so that the interviewer is aware that you're kind of considering all the different perspectives and different aspects. I think another big challenging part of that kind of threw me for the MMI is I definitely love to talk and I love to kind of keep things going. So fitting the MMI answers into the allotted time, because I think U of C was like, I was either 7 or 8 minutes, and you kind of wanted to aim to finish with like 1 to 2 minutes at the end to see if there's any additional questions. So yeah, that was just making sure that I kind of reached all the perspectives and felt that I explored them enough, but not too much, so that somebody could still ask me questions. So that timing thing was a big thing. And the way I combated that was I just had somebody time me, or I timed myself if I was practicing alone. So just that I started to recognize like what 5 minutes of talking felt like, and so that I could kind of be aware of when I was hitting that, like what I felt was the 5 minute mark, and when I thought that I should wrap up. So I think that timing thing for the MMI was a bit hard because, like in comparison for the panel, my panels were like 24 minutes long, and there was kind of like no limit on the number of questions that they could ask you, so it was kind of free flowing, and I didn't feel those time restrictions as I did with the MMI, and having to know how to time myself and when I should be stopping and when I should be wrapping up and how condensed my answers should be. So I found that more challenging than the panel. The panel I thought was a bit easier because, I don't know, you're talking about yourself and your experiences. So I think that was a bit easier for me. A big tip that I have for the panels, and actually any kind of interview thing, or interview type scenario, is what I did to practice was I had all of the canned meds in a table, and I took them and I matched them with my experiences. And I kind of like wrote out a way to, so say one of the canned meds was like, I don't know, communication, or like a good communicator. I would look at all my experiences and I would say, okay, which one, if I had to pick one or two to use them as an example, if the trait communication came up, what would I say? So I practiced writing out the experience aligning with a character trait, so that I would be able to just kind of go through my reel of experiences and put it in wherever it needed to go in the answer, and it would be smooth. I would know how to talk about it in a way that everybody could understand, and that I was explaining what I was doing or what I was participating in, because I think that sometimes when you're talking about your experiences, especially things that you've done for a really long time, they're so familiar to you that when you're explaining them, you think that they're familiar to everybody else, and you leave out those details that are required for the interviewer to fully understand what you're talking about. So I think kind of writing out each of your experiences, how you would talk about it, and then also writing them out in a way that matches those canned meds, or those kind of like big traits that they might ask you, like name a time where you were a leader or demonstrated leadership, are really good, just because then you have your kind of like pocketbook of experiences, and you know how they relate to these common interview questions, and you can just insert them in, and everything sounds super fluid, super smooth, and that you are prepared and ready to go. So, I mean, I got a little bit off topic there, but for me, definitely the hardest were the MMI and the MPI for two different reasons. MMI just for the timing and the multiple perspectives, and kind of making sure that you fit all that in within the time limit I found challenging. And then the MPI just because I was a little bit unfamiliar about the whole concept of MPI and what exactly it was. And then I found the panel a little bit easier. But again, everybody's different. So definitely make sure to practice them all, kind of see where your strengths are, where your weaknesses are, and then definitely target your practice moving forward from there. All right, so what is the next question, so question 6 is, what is the best way to answer a tell me about yourself question? So this one, when I first did it, I just went on a giant tangent and rambled on, and my friend was just left confused, and she was like, I know who you are, but from that answer, I have no idea who you are. So from there, I was big about writing out my answers, and I know that you don't want to sound super rehearsed, so I would never memorize any of them, but I found that getting my ideas out on a paper and kind of being like, okay, so do I actually want to include that point? Is it really relevant? Was really, really helpful for me, and just organizing my thoughts and what points I would include and what points I wouldn't include was, I think, really helpful for me. I mean, it might not work for everybody, but that's kind of what I did to start off. So at first, I just did a practice one with one of my friends, rambled on for a bit, and then realized I needed to refine it. So then that's where I went into the writing stage. I wrote out an answer, kind of edited it, cut it down. Definitely don't memorize it. You want to be candid in your answers and not sound rehearsed, because I don't think that that's super personable. So I kind of just had a vague idea of kind of what I wanted to say. And then again, went back to the same friend, practiced it again, got her advice, and she had some really, really great advice. So she's not in medical school, but she did a bunch of interviews for various master's programs and things in the States, and had practice with the "Tell me about yourself" question specifically. And she also interviewed a bunch of people for various jobs that they were hiring for, and she found what she told me was she really, really liked answers that kind of followed a chronological order, because it was just really easy for the interviewer to follow, especially when the candidates are a bit nervous and are talking a bit quick. And so she found the chronological order super helpful. So that's kind of where I started off with. So I'm from Ontario originally, but obviously I now live in Calgary. So I kind of talked about that at first, and then moved into high school. And I didn't really talk about too much, but horseback riding was a big thing for me, and kind of what's inspired a lot of my activity. So I thought that part was relevant, but other than that, I didn't really mention it too much. And then kind of why I made the decision to move to Calgary, because that's such a big question that people ask me, and kind of what brought me out here. And then what I did in university in terms of extracurriculars, because I think that kind of influences a lot of who I am, at least. So I like to be super active. So I mentioned like being on the rowing team in undergrad, and different activities from baking to volunteering and things like that. And kind of just because that informs a lot of my perspective. And then I summed it up by saying kind of how those things inform who I am today, just in a quick sentence. And how that kind of informs why I'm here today and why I want to pursue medicine. So I left that all super quick, just two kind of summary sentences at the end. But I think that that's kind of a nice way to end the "Tell me about yourself," is to go from distant in the past to why you're here today, why you want to study medicine, just quickly, or what kind of brought you, and say that's what brought me here today, and I'm happy to answer any more questions you have. And it kind of gives that question a nice ending, and doesn't leave you with ending like, and yeah, so that's who I am. It kind of gives you a more pointed end and a clear final answer to yourself. And then also too, if possible, I know that it doesn't fit everybody's personality type, but if you can add a few bits of humor in, and it doesn't have to be super crazy or anything, or like something super witty, but because the "Tell me about yourself" is such a popular question, you kind of do have time to think about it, like months in advance, what your little bit of humor might be. But I think that that's always really appreciated by the interviewers. If you can, I always try to make mine laugh a little bit at least, because I know it is quite a stressful day and quite a tiring day. So if you can add a little bit of a spark, and kind of set yourself apart in that way, I think that is always really good and always makes a good impression. So I guess then my tips in summary for the "Tell me about yourself" question is definitely be yourself. Practice beforehand. I found both saying it and writing it out helped me really refine my answer. To tell your story in a chronological order, because it's super easy to follow that way and it makes sense. And then to try and spice it up with a bit of humor if you can. I know that some people like to go the more serious route, but I definitely tried to add a bit of humor into my answers, and that's just my personality. So definitely whatever works for you and what you're comfortable with, but that's what I was comfortable with. All right, so moving on to question 7. So it is, what is the best way to answer the "why medicine" question? So this question was super daunting to me, and something that I always didn't really want to answer. But I think a big thing is just to make it personal, because I think it's super easy to go down the road of Googling, like, why do I want to become a doctor? And kind of getting everybody else's answers that they've put in on Google and kind of combining them to make them your own. But it's super unoriginal and super unbelievable if you go that way. And I definitely tried that once. And my friend that I was practicing with was just like, no, like that just sounds like you Googled the answer. And I was like, I did. So I think thinking about that question early and reflecting on what personal experiences you have that made you actually want to pursue medicine and pursue this field, especially because medicine is such a long journey, and it's a lot of work. And granted, it's super fun medical school, it's great, but it is a lot of work. So you definitely need to be thinking about why you want to pursue it and be convincing in your answer, and even just for yourself, so that you know that you want to go on that journey, and that's something that you want to do. So for me, reflection, start early, reflect on it. What personal experience did you have that made you want to pursue medicine? And I think definitely make it personal. I think that's the easier way to go, rather than saying like, I really want to be a leader in healthcare, or something super generic like that. Maybe talk about if you were ever in hospital, or if you had a family member and you had a really good experience, say with a physician that you connected with, and that made you want to do that for somebody else, and to be that person, or that big influence in that person's life and their time of need. You could talk about something like that, or if you're super into diagnostics and that problem solving, there's all different ways, but make sure to relate it back to who you are, and how medicine fits with you, your personality, and why your qualities or your traits would make you happy in this career, and make you a good candidate for it. But also, again, it's not a question where you want to prove why you're the best candidate for medicine, but why medicine fits with who you are, and why it would make you happy, and why you would be successful, I guess, in that career. So it's a careful balance of kind of why medicine for you, and not being like, I'm perfect for medicine kind of thing. I don't know if that made total sense, but I think that, yeah. So not always trying to give a list of you're perfect for it, but kind of why medicine is suited to you, and definitely personal experience and personal stories make it, I think, a bit more believable. And I think that goes actually for any answer. If you can say like, oh, let's say the question is about communication, like, why are you a good oh, I really listen to people, and then end it there. It's not as believable if you say, oh, I'm a really great listener. For example, when I was in this club and I was dealing with this problem, I was able to talk to all the different people involved and understand their perspectives. And without listening and being able to understand those perspectives, I wouldn't have been able to come to a solution. Using those specific examples makes a question much more believable. And then I think too, the why medicine one, again, for me, I really liked writing my question answers out, not so that I was going to memorize them, but just so that I could kind of tease apart what I actually was putting into my answers, because sometimes when I would say them out loud, I'd be like, I don't actually know what I just said. So writing them out kind of let me be like, okay, I don't want that idea in, I want that idea in, and kind of refining things. But I know some of my other friends actually recorded themselves so that they weren't writing it out, but that way they could kind of go back and be like, oh, okay, why did I say that? Because I think sometimes when you just say it out loud, at least me, I forget what I actually just said. And then I think my last one for the why medicine one, and I think this is the part that kind of makes that question really challenging, is like a lot of the times if you say, oh, okay, like I want to be a leader, there's a lot of healthcare professions that are leaders other than doctors, whether it's nurses or a paramedic who's on the front line and the one answering those phone calls. You cannot deny that that person is also a leader and also within healthcare. So then I think the question really arises, and that what kind of makes people scared of this question is, okay, so you said you want to be a leader in healthcare, then why not? Why don't you want to be a paramedic? Why a doctor? Why not a nurse? And I think that that's something, again, you really need to think about beforehand and take time to reflect, because paramedics and nurses are so important within our healthcare system. And I think that sometimes when you're asked a follow-up question, then why not a nurse or why not a paramedic? In a situation where, like an interview where there is some anxiety, it can be easy to unintentionally put down those other professions. You really, really don't want to do that. Not only because it will look bad on you in an interview, but also because those people are so important, and they're literally the backbone of our healthcare system. So I think you need to reflect on it, figure out what personal experiences you have, or what personality traits, or what about you makes you perfect for medicine. And then also reflect on those follow-up questions that can be a bit tricky, like why not a nurse or why not a paramedic instead, and have an answer that is personal to you, answers that question. So don't avoid it. Face the fear, face the hard questions, think about it beforehand, and come up with answer that is both politically correct in terms of respecting all the different professions within the field and understanding that they are all very important, but still answering the question of why you want to be a doctor over those other healthcare professions. So I think it is really important to kind of reflect on that. I don't think that you need to necessarily include that totally in your first answer for why medicine, but if it does arise, then you have something to say. So I wouldn't say probably in my initial answer that I want to be a doctor because this and this, and I don't want to be a nurse because of this and this, or I don't want to be a paramedic because this and this. I would only probably include that in my answer if it was specifically asked of me after, but I do in my practice understand that that could be a follow-up question, and that's something that I am prepared for. And I think that goes for any answer that you have. Like, really reflect on what you said. Think about, are there any holes in my answers? Are there any counter arguments to what I've said that don't necessarily make sense? And have those follow-up questions. And I really, when I was practicing with my friends, that's something that I asked them to do. So I would say, okay, pick a question, then during my answer, try and come up with a couple questions to follow up. And it's okay if they're super mean. I'd rather them be mean now, and we get used to those questions that throw me off than have me be totally thrown off in the actual interview. So just definitely getting those follow-up questions, thinking about what hard questions could they ask me. And I think that that's a big one that comes up for the why medicine, and particularly why it does scare some people, including myself. I was definitely nervous for that, but after practice and kind of reflecting on it and not avoiding that question in my practice, I definitely became more comfortable with it. And if it wasn't asked of me during my actual interviews, but I mean, it certainly could be. So definitely prepare for it, definitely be ready. And I know it's kind of weird to not feel like you don't know the answer to a question that is so important, because like you spend so much time applying to medical school and thinking about it, that it's weird not to have a solid answer initially. But I think that that's just where the time comes in. I mean, at least for me, it's something that I definitely had to reflect on for a little bit longer than I thought I would. So I think giving myself time, reflecting on it, and then practicing it, getting people's opinions. And I think that that's really important too, because it kind of, your friends will be able to give you kind of an impression of what that answer sounded like and what it came across as, so that you're not sounding too over-enthusiastic about yourself, and you're not putting down other professions, and kind of making sure that you strike that balance. So yeah, so I guess in summary, I've got my best tips for that is make it personal. Don't be generic. Don't give your answer. Try and tell a personal story and relate it back. And I think that goes for any answer. Just support it with personal evidence. 2, write it out or practice it or record yourself. Just kind of make sure you're keeping yourself accountable to what you actually said, rather than just saying your answers and then not reflecting on them, because you want to really reflect on what you said in order to improve. And that can go also with practicing with other people. And then being aware of those follow-up questions that could be challenging, I think is super important, especially for this question. So the why not the other healthcare professions? Don't necessarily have to include that in your initial answer, but being aware that that could be a possibility. But it also helps you kind of recognize any holes that you had in your initial answer. All right, so moving on to question 8. So question 8 is, how long after the interview would you expect notice of acceptance or rejection? So for me, applying to medical school, I realized how long the process was, like on paper at first. Like I knew I would submit my applications in September and October, and I wouldn't be hearing back till May, but man, it does not seem like it's going to feel like that long until I think you're actually in the process and you're just waiting and waiting and waiting all of those months. So for Calgary, I interviewed in, I think it was March, and then Toronto, I interviewed in April, and then I didn't hear back from either until May. So I heard back from Calgary first at the beginning of May. I think it was a few days before I heard back from Toronto. And then all the Ontario schools get released on the same day. I think this year, I could be wrong, but I think it was like around May 14th. And then Calgary was probably like around like May 8th. around then. But all the Ontario schools, I think they release the date that they will be letting you know in advance, so you kind of can prepare for the day that you'll find out. Whereas Calgary, you didn't know when they were going to release their interview results. You knew it was probably going to be around May, but the year before they released them at the end of April. So you're kind of like in a limbo for a few weeks at the end of April, beginning of May, kind of just refreshing a lot. But I would just try to not get too obsessive about it. And, things happen. And if you don't get in this year, then there's always next year. You never know what will happen in that year. It could be the best year of your life, and you're happy you didn't start medical school too early. And kind of going from there. And I know also, even if you do get rejected at some schools, they'll provide you some feedback. So at the University of Calgary, at least, they do give you some scores and a breakdown of your application from, I think, what your interview score was, to like what your reference score was, to what your academic portion of the application was. I never found my scores back just because they don't give them out to who were accepted. So I don't know the exact breakdown because I never actually saw that, but I know some of my friends who didn't get in this year, but I'm sure they'll get in next year, found it got that breakdown. It was super useful. So even though it was bittersweet that they didn't get in this year, at least they had a solid foundation of practicing and applying, and some feedback to work off of to just strengthen their application for the following year. So you'll in short, you'll expect to hear back in May about your total result. And then you'll hear back about actual interviews. It depends on the school. I know out east, like at Dal and Dalhousie, things you find out in the fall. UBC, you find out in the fall about your interview status. Ontario schools a lot in January, like McMaster and Queens come out in January. I think Ottawa does too, around in January. Calgary in February, you find out about interviews. It also kind of shifts every single year. And then U of T is a little bit different, and they do like a rolling interview application. So I didn't find out about my interview until after my Calgary interview, which was like in the middle of March. But I mean, my interview at Toronto was super late. It was like April 7th of last year. So I found out super late about that one. So it's kind of all over the place. You have like 4 months of different times when you can get the interviews. And I definitely didn't think I was going to get a Toronto interview because it was like middle to the end of March. And I was like, there's no way that they're going to send me an interview now. So don't give up hope. They can come out super late. All right, so question number 9 is, what is the biggest misconception about interviewing for medical school? For me, I think everybody told me in advance that my interviewers will all be super mean, and they'll be super intimidating and things. But I actually found that all of my interviewers, maybe I just got really, really lucky. They were all really, really nice. Like I even remember at the U of C, the timing was off for one of the panels, so we finished. She thought that we were supposed to finish 8 minutes earlier than we did, so we kind of just had a random 8 minutes at the end, and we just talked about our favorite TV shows and things like that. And I know that they're not really supposed to talk about personal things, but mine were open books, and they were very happy to kind of make me feel comfortable and have a good time. And at least that was my experience. And then especially at U of T, they were super, super nice. So I think that was really great. And then same for all the applicants. I didn't meet anybody that I thought was mean or like trying to intimidate me or not make me feel comfortable at the interview. I think most of the people at the interview we're all trying to go to a helping profession, and we're all pretty moral and helping, at least, or that's what I kind of interpreted. And so I think that it's definitely more it's still intimidating. It's definitely more of a welcoming environment than I anticipated. So that was really, really nice. And I think don't get scared that you'll get a bunch of mean interviewers that are all super rude, because at least like from my experience, I didn't. I know some of my friends got like the odd one that wasn't super nice, and I think just understand, don't take that personally. And sometimes either they're told to be like that, or that's just their personality, and that's kind of what everybody's getting. So I think don't be too intimidating, and kind of don't think that everybody is mean at the interviews. And then I think too, another big misconception is that you can't prepare. I think it's like the elusive cars rumor where you can't prepare for cars. At least from my personal experience, I think you can prepare a lot for both. But I'm also definitely a preparer. Like I love to be organized. I love to be on top of things like this. So I think practice makes perfect, whether it's cars or whether it's the interview. I was not going to be winging it. And I think that practicing, whether it's with MD consultants or with your friends or alone in your room, all helps. It all helps to make your answers fluid, clear, and cohesive. And I think that that's really important. I mean, for some people, I'm sure that they just have those skills naturally. But for me, I definitely wanted to practice. I think that the interview was one day, and it makes it a big part of your application. You spend so much time already writing your application. You spend so much money submitting your application. I spend so much time studying for the MCAT. You might as well invest a bit more time and make your interview skills perfect so that you're ready. You're going to put your best foot forward. You're going to give them the best version of yourself and make a good impression. So I think don't be susceptible to the rumors that you can't practice, because at least for me, I think that that's what helped me be successful in my interview. Alrighty, so I think the last question we have here is, was there anything that caught you by surprise during the interview process? I think really for me, it was like how tired I actually was. And like I did do full length practice interviews and talk for the full 4 hours or however long, I forget how long I calculated it would be, but I did do all of that and I practiced almost every day, but still I was just exhausted. I think for me, a big part of it was just like meeting so many new people and introducing yourself to all the different applicants and putting yourself in a vulnerable situation, and the nerves and the anxiety. I think it just really took a toll on me, and it really exhausted me. So I think that was like a big surprise. And again, I think we went over some tips about reducing fatigue, but getting a good night's sleep beforehand is good. Practicing for the full length of the interview, I think, is really important. Bringing snacks and things to kind of keep yourself fueled and keep yourself going. And then also, I think another good one, just to kind of minimize stress in every way possible. If you are lucky enough to be there the day before, kind of go to that interview spot or where you're supposed to be so that nothing is a surprise and nothing takes you off guard the day of, because the more you can limit the anxiety that you're feeling, I think the better it will be and the better it will go, and the less exhausted you'll feel. So I think that that's probably what took me off guard. Like I definitely got home after my interview and was just ready to go to bed. I interviewed in the morning for UC, and I think we finished probably at like, I don't know, like one or so. And I literally just had to take a nap. I was done. So I think that was a thing that caught me off guard. I think that was it though, but yeah, I think the whole thing is, and really just talk to other people too that have already been through the interview process, and they can kind of give you an idea of how the day will go and like what to expect, so that nothing is kind of catching you too much off guard, because whether it's you're going to a different spot or just don't have anywhere to put your coat or your purse, asking those questions beforehand and being prepared about what to expect really helps to reduce that anxiety and reduce things catching you off guard, because I think that can sometimes make you stumble a bit. So kind of just trying to feel everything out beforehand, I think is really important. All right, so let me just see if we have any other questions, if anybody tuned in. All right, it doesn't look like it, so I think that kind of wraps things up. And then I also just want to say that MD consultants provide comprehensive interview prep throughout MMI circuits. with one-on-one consultants. I know they also can help you prep for the MPI and the panel interviews. And again, as I always say, practice makes perfect. And they do that with one-on-one consultants with medical students. And so to book your appointment, you can visit mdconsultants.ca or you can email info@mdconsultants.ca. And there's also been more information provided in the links listed in the comments. So that email, as well as a link to the website, can be found in the comments, as well as if you visit the MD Consultants Facebook page. So I hope I answered everybody's questions, and if you have any more, feel free to reach out to MD Consultants, and they'll definitely be happy to answer them. So it was nice talking to everybody, and hope you guys have a great rest of the day. Happy Friday.